You step through a gate of sharpened wood, and the air hits you first, a sour, oily tang of smoke and old blood that settles in the back of the throat. The stakes stand in rows like a grove of dark teeth. In the distance, a man eats his meal as if at a feast, the silhouette of poles framing his knife and plate. There is a slow, bureaucratic order to the scene, stakes planted by compass and cord, a geometry meant to be read at a distance. You hear wood rasp in the wind, and, beneath it, the small sounds that make a human scene. Coughing, a child learning to hush, the wet scrape of a boot in mud. In the space between those sounds and the order of poles, terror becomes a deliberate language. If you want to see how terror was made into policy, stay until the end. Subscribe, hit the bell, and like if you want more deep history. Vlad III, later called Tepes by some and Dracula by others, ruled Wallachia with measures that were as theatrical as they were ruthless. To understand the fate of the Ottoman prisoners who found themselves under his control, who became both message and margin in a struggle with an empire, one must move beyond the caricature and into the evidence, the chroniclers, and the psychology that may explain why a prince turned punishment into spectacle. What follows stitches together known events, contemporary reports, and reasoned interpretation. Where voices are speculative, that is noted as such. Vlad was born into a world of shifting loyalties and regional polities under the looming shadow of the Ottoman state. In the 1430s and 1440s, the balance of power in southeastern Europe was fragile. Young princes were pawns and hostages. Families with centuries of claims learned to calculate survival as carefully as alliances. Vlad's formative years overlapped with captivity. He and his brother Radu were at times used as guarantees of their father's fidelity to the Sultan. Contemporary sources diverge on the details, but the arc is consistent. Exposure to the Ottoman court, to the discipline of janissary barracks, to the rituals of power and humiliation shaped him. This period, I suggest, was not simply a schooling in manners, but a psychological crucible. One interpretation is that his time as a hostage created an association between humiliation. He learned that the public display of dominance could substitute for political weakness. This is an interpretation, not a proof, but it helps explain a later preference for methods that made obedience visual and irreversible. When Vlad took power in the 1450s, he faced a fractious nobility, boyars who sat like rival beasts in his court, a neighbor kingdom with shifting loyalties, and an empire to the south that was patently expansionist. Domestic consolidation required ruthless action. He saw the boyars as a direct threat, their private alliances, their capacity for collusion with Hungary or the Ottomans, and their habit of skimming resources from a state already under strain. His solution, a campaign of purges, confiscations, and a legal order enforced by terror, was meant to break the old patterns and centralize authority. What made Vlad different from previous princes was not merely the severity of his punishments, but the aesthetics of their presentation. Punishment under him was choreographed. The rods and stakes were not hidden instruments of private revenge. They were set out for a public to behold. The geometry of punishment, staggered lines, cones of stakes visible from the road, amplified the intended message: obedience or humiliation, stability or utter disgrace. There is a functional logic to this. When a ruler makes suffering visible, he converts fear into a currency of deterrence. But visibility changes the nature of violence. It turns suffering into sign. Ottoman prisoners who fell into Vlad's hands were caught within that sign system. They were, in a sense, raw political material. Ottoman sources recorded incidents in tones that ranged from diplomatic indignation to rhetorical horror. Saxon and Hungarian pamphlets added their own accounts, sometimes embellishing, sometimes condemning, and always contributing to the reputation that would travel beyond Wallachia's borders. Numbers are contested. One report might claim thousands impaled, another much fewer. These figures should be treated as contested, yet the pattern described across sources, public displays of human suffering used to intimidate both locals and enemies, remains consistent. Vlad's methods were adapted to audiences. Inside Wallachia, impalement and public executions were meant to cow recalcitrant nobles and criminals. For Ottoman captives, soldiers, scouts, and the occasional messenger, the spectacle had an external audience. The pegs in the ground were not only for the local peasant, but for the approaching caravan, for the messenger who carried news back to the Sultan. In that sense, the field of stakes functioned as diplomacy by terror. A state message read in 3 registers: to the boyars, submit; to neighbors, I can make order and enforce it; to the Ottomans, do not assume weakness. This is where the psychological and strategic threads meet. Strategically, Vlad did not have the military weight to contest Ottoman arms in a sustained campaign. He possessed a small principality, difficult terrain, and the capability for sudden raids. Turning cruelty into deterrence asymmetrically leveraged his limited resources. Psychologically, having internalized humiliation and learned its effects, he weaponized it. If one accepts the interpretation that his captivity taught him the uses of spectacle, then impalement becomes an extension of survival strategy, a technology of fear that substitutes for walls and numbers. Yet, such a substitution is brittle. Terror is effective in the short term when it creates a reputation that predates the event, but it is also corrosive. It eats at the social bonds that sustain governance. The boyars who were left alive after purges harbored resentments. Towns where people watched their neighbors publicly destroyed carried the memory of that destruction forward. The geometry of stakes thus created not only a message to outsiders, but an internal landscape of trauma. In the winter of 1462, as Sultan Mehmed II ready to campaign that would test Wallachia's limits, that internal landscape mattered. Ottoman preparatory reports noted skirmishes, raids that disrupted supply lines, and the apparent unpredictability of Vlad's responses. The prince did not meet the Sultan in open-pitched battle. He preferred harassment, ambush, and the use of terrain. The night attack that would later be celebrated in some sources as a hand-to-hand triumph, and in others as a brush with annihilation, was a composite of daring and desperation. Raids, small unit infiltration, and psychological operations that aimed to unsettle the Ottoman force. One of the most striking episodes occurred as the Ottoman column approached Targovishte. Ottoman sources reported a scene that visitors and diplomats would later recount with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Fields near the road studded with poles, and with them the terrible figures of those once human. Local peasants told of an odor that lingered for days, and of dogs that refused to cross the bounds of the stakes. A particular interpolated account describes a banquet set before the stakes, a staged inversion where the ruler ate while the dead stood witness. That inversion, whether wholly factual or partly rhetorical, is the key to understanding the spectacle. It collapsed the boundary between the ruler's life and the public ruin he orchestrated. It made the everyday act of eating a compact with terror. We can reconstruct a short exchange. The following is dramatized reconstruction, not a verbatim record. A messenger from the Ottoman camp watched from a ridge and said, "What manner of lord marks his road with corpses?" A Wallachian rider, perhaps part of Vlad's retinue, answered, "He marks it so your master remembers the price of crossing his land." The line functions as a shorthand of the logic Vlad deployed, clear, rhetorical, and frightening. Mehmed responded with calculated force. His army was not only a fighting instrument, but a politically sensitive signal. The Sultan could not ignore a neighbor who treated Ottoman soldiers as instruments to be displayed. The campaign that followed combined military objectives with a need to reassert imperial dignity. Yet, when the Ottoman column advanced, it encountered a land emptied and charred, supplies diminished, roads broken, and the ubiquity of stakes made movement psychologically heavy. The forest of impaled, as chroniclers would call it, became a psychological terrain as much as a physical one. What did the forest do? It altered perception. A soldier marching through such a scene would feel the past weight of violence pressing on the present.
A linea di poles read like a map of humiliation. The smell attached meaning to the landscape. For an army dependent on morale and orderly logistics, that is an advantage for the defender. In addition to physical impediments, Vlad's forces used night raids and small-scale harassment to undermine the Ottoman sense of control. The combination of visible cruelty and elusive guerrilla tactics made the campaign costly in attention and in pride. This strategy yielded a tactical effect. Ottoman commanders recorded confusion and a decline in initiative. Some of Mehmed's advisors counseled a retreat, others demanded retribution. The Sultan, as an image-conscious ruler, could not withdraw without damage to his prestige. So he pushed forward, and the resulting standoff produced the very images that would spread across Europe and into Ottoman chronicles. Images carefully narrated for political effect by both sides. Each side's propaganda fed into the other's reputation. Ottoman accounts emphasized barbarity to justify invasion. European and Wallachian narratives amplified resistance and cruelty to warn and to recruit allies. Yet it is crucial not to romanticize this outcome. The moral cost was immense. For Wallachia, the short-term success, a forceful message that delayed or complicated Ottoman operations, came at the expense of social cohesion. For the Ottomans, the embarrassment and indignation fueled a determination that would carry into subsequent campaigns. For Vlad himself, reputation as a terrifying ruler circulated within and beyond his borders, limiting options for diplomacy and making enemies not only of his foes, but of potential allies. The archival traces give us fragments, a letter here, a chronicler's aside there, Ottoman logistical notes that speak to delays and surprises. Interpreting those fragments requires care. Some historians emphasize the rational calculation. Vlad's terror policy was a rational attempt at deterrence by a weak state. Others argue that personal pathology, an obsession with control rooted in trauma, explains the extremity of his measures. A balanced reading allows both. Strategic necessity shaping choices that were also filtered through violent personal predispositions. There is also the matter of narrative economy. A ruler who uses spectacle to frighten also constructs a story about himself. Vlad's narrative, as disseminated through pamphlets and courtly gossip, did not remain purely negative. In some quarters, those stories reinforced his image as a staunch defender of Christendom against Ottoman expansion, a defender whose severity had a purpose. That perception, useful for recruiting allies or intimidating enemies, complicated how his deeds were read at the time and how they would be repeated thereafter. As the campaign ground on and diplomatic overtures shifted, another element came into play: the boyars' loyalties.
Where fear should have bound communities together under a central authority, it instead created fissures. Boyars who survived purges were cautious, resentful, and in some cases actively sabotaging. This internal instability would eventually prove as dangerous as any external threat. Consider an imagined scene within Vlad's palace after the return from an especially successful raid. Again, this is a reconstruction meant to illuminate motive rather than to present direct evidence. In the candle-lit hall, the prince sat with maps, pressing a finger onto a place where an Ottoman road crossed a ridge. A counselor said, "We have bought time. They will think twice." Vlad's face was unreadable. He looked at the counselor and replied, "Time is the only coin I have. I will spend it so they remember its cost." The reply, while dramatized, captures a logic: the conversion of scarcity into psychological expenditure. But what of the prisoners themselves? The people taken in skirmishes were often soldiers, but they could also be civilians, traders, men caught outside their lines, envoys. Their fates varied. Some were ransomed, some exchanged, others used as the raw materials of spectacle. Reports vary on whether impalement was systematic or selective. What is clearer is that brutality served communicative ends. To impale a captain and leave his body visible at a crossroads sent a different message than to kill and bury anonymously. The logic extended beyond death. The placement of bodies, the timing of displays, and the public rituals surrounding punishment all mattered. It is worth pausing to underline a methodological point. When discussing these events, one must resist the temptation to present a single causal narrative. Human actions are seldom reducible. Vlad's choices were the product of contingency, of hostage experiences, of institutional weakness, of the politics of the region, and of his character. Each of these factors interacts. The historian's task is to map probable intersections rather than to declare singular motives. By the time the Ottomans decided to act decisively, the international narrative had hardened. Mehmed II could be read as responding to a challenge to Ottoman honor. He could also be read as pursuing expansion that would naturally incorporate Wallachian lands. Both readings are valid. The campaign that followed was decisive in the sense that it forced confrontations and produced images that would outlast immediate events. When Ottoman columns reached fields marked by stakes, they encountered an enemy that had transformed the landscape into accusation. The psychological effect cannot be overstated. An army's cohesion depends in part on the predictability of its environment. Vlad disrupted that predictability. Yet ruin begets ruin. The same mechanisms that produced deterrence also produced enemies. By alienating his own nobility and by making retribution inevitable, Vlad planted the seeds of his decline. His fall would be as much internal as external. Conspiracies, betrayals, and shifting alliances.
The spectacle that had consolidated his power also made reconciliation costly. The moral paradox is stark. Terror, as a tool of order, can produce momentary obedience, but often at the expense of the very order it was meant to secure. In the end, the fate of Ottoman prisoners under Vlad the Impaler is not merely an account of horror. It is a case study in how a polity without resources can convert cruelty into leverage, and how that leverage corrodes the polity itself. The forest of Impaled becomes a mirror. It reflected the limits of fear as governance, and it reflected the human capacity to both wield and be consumed by spectacle. What remains are the stories, the contested numbers, and the smell that lingers at the edge of memory. Ottoman ambassadors wrote of outrage. European pamphlets amplified dread. Local peasants passed down the tales in whispers. Each retelling reshaped the facts. For historians, the task is to read the layers: what was done, how it was perceived, and what strategic logic, if any, justified it. Days later, with winter pressing and supply lines thin, the calculus shifted again. The Sultan's commanders argued for a demonstration of force. Vlad's network of spies and local guides ran interference. The geography, once an ally, became a stage for the larger moral question. Can terror be an instrument of statecraft without unmaking the state that uses it? That question did not receive a neat answer in the 15th century. It still presses on modern readers. End of this scene. The narrative continues to examine the military climax, the Ottoman retreat, Vlad's political decline, and the moral coda that connects his choices to the larger theme of terror as policy. The Ottoman columns, once confident in the logic of numbers and mounted force, found themselves negotiating a landscape that no longer behaved according to expectation. Supply trains slowed beneath the weight of winter and of constant harassment. Foragers returned with carts half empty or not at all. Guides who had been paid lip service to knowledge of the region proved unreliable when stakes and burned homesteads remade familiar routes into traps. Small parties sent to scout found themselves cut off by bands who knew every hollow and ravine. When a column pushed forward, it did so under the steady pressure of anxiety. What lay beyond the next hill was not only an enemy, but the possibility of another spectacle of death, a barbed message to those who would follow. Tactically, the Ottomans adapted. They sent detachments to clear supply lines, burned suspected camps, and attempted to establish local garrisons. Strategically, Mehmed's commanders had to weigh the costs. Further advance meant further attrition in a terrain where the defenders could choose time and place. If you end his government is shrouded in contradictory accounts, his post-mortem trajectory into legend is less ambiguous. News of Vlad's deeds traveled in multiple registers. Ottoman dispatches recounted him as a cruel irregularity to be corrected. Western pamphlets amplified the monstrous image, sometimes with deliberate exaggeration intended to sell copies to a market hungry for marvels. Moldavian and Wallachian peasants retold episodes that mixed terror, retribution, and mundane gossip. The figure of the Impaler became a palimpsest on which neighbors and enemies wrote their fears. In the Ottoman imagination, he was a cautionary tale about border disorder. In the West, printers seeking sensational copy transformed him into a moral horror rather than an object of statecraft. Margins of maps and travelogues took up his story as proof that the lands beyond Christendom's immediate gaze were places where kings could enact grotesque justice. Historians have, across centuries, continued this layering. For some, Vlad is an exemplar of desperate governance. How a prince with limited fiscal and military resources converts terror into temporary solvency of authority. For others, he is a pathological strongman whose excesses delegitimized rule and invited foreign domination. Scholars of memory have shown how his story has been used for nationalist ends, reworked in art, theater, and, in later centuries, literature that bears only a faint genealogical link to 15th century realities. To read those uses is to see how historical figures are not merely subjects of inquiry, but raw material for political and cultural projects. The moral coda is not a neat verdict, but a set of interlocking observations. First, spectacle can cohere power in the short term by creating a common fear that binds subjects through obedience. But that unity is brittle. It depends on the continuate plausibility of punishment, on the perception that the ruler's will is both effective and just in the eyes of those who must carry it out. When punishment becomes unpredictable, or when it targets the elite power brokers whose cooperation is necessary, spectacle ceases to be an instrument and becomes a provocation. Second, terror externalizes cost. The immediate gain, deterrence, resource extraction, symbolic domination, appears as a saving. Yet the hidden costs include the erosion of legitimacy, the incentive to conspiracy, and the hardening of external coalitions against the persecutor. Third, memory distorts motive. The more a polity relies on violence for short-term ends, the more its record will be hammered into memorable images, images that future actors can manipulate. Thus, the forest of stakes that once functioned as military theater becomes in time a lasting emblem divorced from the logistical and political contingencies that produced it. There is also a lesson about the limits of interpreting past acts solely through modern moral lenses.